There are many films from the 90s that were ahead of their time with their visuals, special effects, and ideas. And The Fifth Element is a bright representative of that wonderful era. All films of that time shared one common feature. The creators paid little attention to backstories and often ignored explanations. That's why viewers had hundreds of questions while watching. The Fifth Element is no exception. And even though at the beginning of the film we were given a 10-minute glimpse into the past, we never really learned who the Mando Shawan Guardians were, where they got the elemental stones, or what the Fifth Element truly represented. But is that really the case? If you carefully rewatch the film, you can actually find some answers, although most either went unnoticed or were never explained at all. That's why I decided to change that. My name is Evgeny, and today we are breaking down The Fifth Element. It's time to uncover the full truth about the Guardians, about the arc that holds all life in the universe, and what exactly led to the emergence of the entity that is interpreted as absolute evil and the antithesis of all living things. I promise it's going to be interesting. Let's begin. Thanks so much for watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting. It really helps the channel grow. Big thanks to everyone supporting via PayPal or Patreon. You're legends. You help me make better content faster. Want to support? Links are in the description. For convenience, the video will be divided into 3 parts. The first will be called Secrets of the Past. So let's start with the general story on which the entire plot of The Fifth Element is built. And this story begins long before the events of the film. Approximately 10,000 years before our era, an ancient, highly advanced civilization known to us as the Mando Shawans, sometimes translated as the Mindachivas, uncovered the secrets of the universe. They learned to partially see the future and predict events. At this stage of understanding, they realized that everything in the universe is cyclical and that every action must have an opposing force. If there is a power that gives life, there must also exist the antithesis of life, an entity that annihilates all living things, a kind of universal balance. But to truly understand how this happens, they needed practical knowledge. They didn't know exactly in which time period this would occur, what evil looked like, or in which star system it would appear. Knowledge was their only path to saving all life. So the Mando Shawans began their preparations for the end of the world. The first thing they did was rid themselves of their organic bodies. They created massive robotic metal shells into which the Mando Shawans transferred their consciousness. This allowed them to solve several problems. First, they were no longer of interest to the entity, since they were no longer an organic form of life. Second, the Mando Shawans became an immortal race that retained all their knowledge. But there was another problem. What about all the living organisms that inhabited the universe? They would be annihilated by absolute evil. Since the Mando Shawans had no weapon or even a clear understanding of how to fight this entity, they had to make a difficult decision. They traveled across the cosmos to living planets and created an ark for storing genetic material. They took the DNA source of the fauna from each planet where life existed. This source was placed into a sarcophagus for safekeeping, which we know as the Fifth Element. This way, the Mando Shawans would have the ability to recreate all living organisms after the apocalypse in 7737 BC, based on Earth time, which is important. There was a conjunction of 3 planets. This event was a harbinger that the time had come for the annihilation of all life. At the point of intersection, an entity appeared, which the film calls absolute evil. But the Mando Shawans were ready. Their primary goal now was to study the object, which appeared as a planetoid. The massive sphere first destroyed Earth and then moved on to other systems in the cosmos, ultimately wiping out all life in the universe. All life except for the Mando Shawans and the sarcophagus where the genetic material was stored. This experience was not in vain. The Guardians were able to determine the exact time when the entity appeared, the place where it emerged, and which planet would be the first target of absolute evil. They also discovered that the entity could not be destroyed. All of their weapons were useless, and they came to understand that it possessed intelligence and was made up of 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. On top of that, the object could at will change its density and composition, meaning the sphere could transform into liquid, fire, air, or even earth. In the end, the object destroyed all life and then transformed into stone, becoming yet another planet. Perhaps this very process leads to the creation of matter in the cosmos and the formation of new planets and stars. Using this knowledge, the Mandoshawans created 4 stones, each one corresponding to an element from which evil was composed. At the center, they placed the arc, the very same 5th element, and concentrated energy in the form of a beam of light, which they sent to all corners of the cosmos, to the same planets that had once hosted life before the apocalypse. In this way, they were able to return life to those planets. But the process of recreating life was extremely complex and required immense resources, particularly time. And it didn't quite feel like salvation, since the entity had already annihilated all forms of life. That's why they needed to come up with a way to actually fight evil. The Guardians understood that the object would only stop once it had completely eradicated life. And there was no other way because it was programmed for that purpose. The solution was actually very simple. In 2737 BC, absolute evil appeared in the cosmos once again. The Mandoshawans already knew which planet would be its first victim, Earth. So they built a temple on the planet's surface. Inside it, they placed the 4 stones and the 5th element. They had already used this mechanism once before, after the annihilation. But this time, the Guardians directed the beam of life straight at the sphere. Having received the genetic material of all living things, the sphere stopped in Earth's orbit. This is how our planet acquired its first satellite, which we now know as the Moon. Earth would receive its second satellite much later, in the events of the 5th element itself. From this information, we can conclude that before the events of the film, the Guardians had only managed to stop absolute evil once, because there is only one satellite orbiting our planet, the Moon. Evil is programmed to absorb all life, and once it received the full genetic material from the 5th element, its mission was complete. That's why it transformed into stone. This is the general and main story used in the film. But many questions remain. Why did Lilu, when recreated from the fragment of the sarcophagus, take on a human form if it contained the DNA source of every living being in the universe? If the Mandoshawans could partially see the future, why did they allow the Mangalores to attack their ship? And that's why we should move on to the second part of the video, the explanation. So, to begin, let's take a look at the theory that the Guardians could foresee future events. This becomes clear right at the very beginning of the film. They arrived on Earth in the first month of 1914. I couldn't find the exact day, but even this date is enough to understand that the Guardians, 6 months before the start of World War I, already knew it was going to happen, and Earth could no longer be considered a safe place to store the 5th element.
But war is coming. Stone's not safe on Earth anymore.
Therefore, it can be assumed that they could foresee all the events in the film, even the attack on their ship by the Mangalores. Let's take a closer look at this moment of the attack. In this scene, we see that the Guardians have no means of defense, no force fields or counter weapons to repel an attack from just 2 fighters, such highly advanced beings, and yet such an easy defeat. But this race is not warlike, and weapons are forbidden in their civilization. They are programmed for only one primary purpose: to save all life. Their ultimate goal is to destroy evil. Everything else is of no interest to them. As stated in the additional materials, the Guardians lived at the edge of the cosmos, constantly waiting for the coming of evil. They didn't engage in trade, form diplomatic alliances, hold negotiations, or interfere in the affairs of other races. I believe it's unlikely they experience emotions that are inherent to humans: joy, love, or fear. They are simply machines into which consciousness was placed. Unfortunately, there is no information about the name of their home planet or its coordinates. On Earth, they created a small group of chosen people who had access to all the information. Their task was to keep the secret hidden, as well as the temple where the 5th element was located. And when the time came, the Mandoshawans immediately set their plan of salvation into motion: the transportation of the 5th element to Earth, just as they had promised.
When evil returns, so shall we.
and when the ship collided with the satellite, nothing was left of it. But at the crash site, people were only able to find one artificially created material. Why is this so important? The thing is, many video bloggers believe that the Guardians are not giant clumsy robots, but rather suits inside which an organic Mando-Shawan body is hidden. I understand why and where this theory comes from. During the creation of the Guardian's appearance, a huge number of concept art sketches were made, showing some sort of humanoid creature inside an exoskeleton or armor. But Luc Besson immediately rejected all these ideas, and the final version we saw in the film was created. The director wanted to portray the Guardians in such a way that viewers would see them as a peaceful race, completely devoid of aggression. The Guardians had to look as kind and, strangely enough, as endearing as possible. Luc Besson himself neither confirmed nor denied the theory that the Mando-Shawans are robots. He only said that there is already enough information in the film to understand that the Guardians are not biological beings. They are a completely unknown form of life that the human mind cannot comprehend. There is no biological component in their bodies. That is why they are immortal, and time no longer has any meaning for their race. Let's go back to the destruction of the Mando-Shawan ship. We learned that at the crash site there was no biological material at all, except for the surviving right hand. But if there had been a Guardian inside those massive suits, the human expedition would have been able to find at least a trace of organic matter. Yet there was nothing, only the fragment of the fifth element's hand. And if we take into account the fact that the chest the Mangalores found, the one they believed contained the 4 elemental stones, was completely intact, then there should have been plenty of surviving debris. But no, there was only a single fragment of the sarcophagus. Later, in the laboratory, using the surviving piece of the fifth element, humans were able to recreate a body using a bioprinter. And we find out that it's a human. But how? If the object held millions of different DNA chains, why specifically a human? The answer is that the bioprinting process was created by humans for the purpose of reconstructing human bodies and healing fatal injuries. The regeneration chamber was capable of reproducing only a human body. The bioprinter was programmed and designed solely for that task. By the way, this technology was prohibited for use in recreating an entire organism from a fragment. It was only allowed for healing purposes, which is why it was classified equipment. These Guardians knew that humans had a regeneration capsule. They were also aware of all of Zorg's plans. The Mangalores were hunting for the stones. They knew nothing about the fifth element, and they didn't need to know. They were simply carrying out Zorg's orders, nothing more. This is a very unintelligent race, and we will talk about them in the next part of the video. The Mando-Shawans knew that Zorg was under the control of the entity. That's why they hid the stones in a secure place, inside the body of Daiva Plava Laguna. They foresaw everything, the ship's destruction, and even the fact that humans would find a piece of the sarcophagus and be able to recreate the organism using its genetic material. As a result of all these events, Lilu appeared to the world.
Lilu?
Here, 2 questions arise. Is this the first time she has taken human form? If you look at the old drawings in the book shown by Father Vito Cornelius, you can see that Lilu is still an immobile sarcophagus. In this state, the Mando-Shawans took her from the temple. This means she had been stored there all these years, 5,000 years since being used as a super weapon against absolute evil. But in fact, from the very beginning of her existence, the fifth element appeared and was kept in the form of a sarcophagus. And she only took on a human form thanks to the scientists and the bioprinter. But on the walls, the fifth element is depicted as a human. I think this is simply a continuity error in the film. There are thousands of them. Another supposed mistake is that Lilu knows the divine language and can speak it. But here I will defend the film's creators, because there was one very important moment that proves that while Lilu was in the sarcophagus, she had consciousness. After all, she knew exactly where the Mando-Shawans had hidden the 4 stones.
Gave the stones to someone that they could trust?
She's looking for the address.
Therefore, they must have told her everything while transporting her to Earth. Lilu possesses all the necessary information, and it wasn't something that was programmed into her from the start. But here's the question. How is it that she doesn't know the English language, can't speak it, yet somehow knows how to read it?
Please. Help.
As I said, there are plenty of inconsistencies and continuity errors in the film. And before I move on to the third part of the video, I think it's the perfect time to talk about the different races in the film. If I've already shared the most interesting details about the Mandoshawans, we now have the Mangalores and Diva Plava Laguna left to cover. Let's start with the Mangalores. In the past, before the events of the film, they had an entire empire that conquered and enslaved other planets. That is, until they crossed paths with humans. By then, humanity was already quite advanced, and in a decisive war that took place in 2130, humans managed to crush the entire Mangalore fleet in just 6 months. After that, the Mangalores were forced to flee and hide in every corner of the cosmos. Now they work as mercenaries. They are extremely cheap labor, easily manipulated, and willing to take on any job. They have nothing left to lose. They are essentially intergalactic terrorists. There are 3 main features of their physiology. First, any soldier could change the shape of their body, which was very useful for infiltration. Though there are technologies that can break through their disguises, as shown in the film when a pair of Mangalores tried to disguise themselves to board the flight to Floston Paradise. The second feature is that Mangalores are incapable of lying. They always tell the truth. Even if they try to deceive someone, it becomes painfully obvious, and they start to tremble, gag, or even vomit. Again, this was shown when 2 of them attempted to board the flight. The third feature is that they are hermaphrodites. They do not have a concept of gender, even though the film mostly depicts them as male. But nothing prevents them from changing their form into a female. Their ability to transfigure is unique, and no other species in the Fifth Element universe possesses this ability. But it's still unclear how such a foolish race managed to build spaceships and fighter crafts. Well, let's just chalk that up to things we don't know. Of course, I can't skip over Diva Plava Laguna because this organism is truly a miracle of nature.
Sounds like a freak of nature to me.
Yeah.
If we refer to all available sources of information about this race, including fandom wikis and other online platforms, it becomes clear that this species lives on a planet whose surface is completely covered in water. There are plenty of hints about this in the film as well. Their appearance, the color of their skin, and of course their blue blood, even their tears are blue. This blood color is often found in certain species of mollusks. It's due to the fact that instead of hemoglobin, their blood contains hemocyanin. Hemocyanin is a copper-based respiratory pigment from the metalloprotein group. It's essentially a functional analog of hemoglobin and is primarily found in marine creatures, though it's occasionally found in insects as well. And the diva's name, Plava Laguna, literally translates as Blue Lagoon. But if this being lived in water, why would she have double vocal cords capable of producing even the lowest frequencies? Perhaps Luc Besson was inspired by the idea of a siren. It's unclear. She also has nails just like a human. There are tubes protruding from her head and back, though their purpose is unknown. Breathing? Unlikely, since she has a nose and standard nostrils. She has no fins, and how could her body even hold 4 stones? Does she even have internal organs? Overall, I'm completely at a loss. If you have any ideas, share them in the comments. But the fact that the diva looks, let's say, so striking is thanks to the artist Patrice Garcia. He was given complete creative freedom, and his imagination led to what could be called a mistake of nature. But in 1997, it looked pretty impressive, and her voice is simply a masterpiece, which to this day remains one of the defining trademarks of the Fifth Element. From a scientific standpoint, however, such an organism could hardly exist. The Fifth Element is one of the most memorable films of the golden era of 90s cinema. It was released on May 7, 1997. It was the most expensive European production at the time, with a budget of $90 million. Its box office gross reached $240 million. It went down in history as the best action comedy of 1997, and at the same time earned another title, the worst science fiction film in the history of cinema. The movie was both criticized and praised. It was criticized for its huge inconsistencies and silly mistakes. In 1998, Total Film magazine published an article where they managed to find 1,001 continuity errors. Some of the most well-known mistakes were visible even to the naked eye. For example, the Mandoshawans arrive in 1914, and later the screen shows the caption, 300 years later. This would mean the events of the film take place in 2214, but no, the calendar shows the year 2263. The problems didn't stop with higher math and the blatant disregard for the laws of physics. There was also the careless attitude of the camera crew and the script writers. The guardian who held the key was locked in a secret chamber. No one ever came back for him or even tried to save him. When Dallas enters the temple, there's no trace or sign whatsoever of that Mandoshawan's presence. Lilu's tattoo on her right arm changed its position 12 different times. On the fifth element, which had stood for thousands of years, there was even a clear imprint of a human hand. And where did all that lighting in the chamber come from? It's unlikely that it was all Aziz's doing.
Aziz, light!
Aziz, light.
The professor has 3 hands, and 2 of them are right hands. In one, he's holding a cup of water, and in the other, a dusting brush. Behind him, the tripod keeps changing. Sometimes it's standing, sometimes it's lying down. When the guardians carry out the sarcophagus, you can see that the right hand is open, but on the fragment, it's clenched into a fist. On the computer monitor, there's an enormous number of DNA chains displayed. Yet the scientists talk about 200,000 chromosomes, which doesn't actually affect the uniqueness of the being. For instance, the adder's tongue fern has 1,160 chromosomes, while humans have 46. But the adder's tongue fern is just a plant. Even with that many chromosomes, it doesn't make it some kind of super fern. Luc Besson invented a divine language for the film, which consisted of more than 400 words. That's why Mila Jovovich learned it and spoke it fluently in the movie. 900 different costumes, complex animatronics, so much effort, and so many mistakes. And what I've told you is only about 1% of all the silly inconsistencies. But back then, audiences weren't as demanding as they are now. That's why the film was warmly received, and theaters had long lines for the premiere. Personally, I watched it about 10 times, and I was always puzzled, trying to figure out where I knew the actor who played Father Vito Cornelius from. Well, it turns out he's the same android Ash from the 1979 film Alien, and he's also Bilbo Baggins from The Lord of the Rings. If you didn't know that either, don't forget to leave a like for my efforts and hard work.